In today's video, we will be going through 4 games from a very prestigious event happening right now. The UK versus Ukraine Solidarity Match between Michael Adams, legend from England, against Grandmaster Andrei Volokitin from Ukraine. These two players are facing each other in an 8-round match. And the colors are alternating, and there's a huge prize fund of $45,000. The winner receives $30,000, and the one that loses still receives $15,000. In case of a tie, the players split the prize fund, and each player receives $20,000. And indeed, your math is correct, that is less than the official prize fund, which means that there is a lot at stake, and the players have more incentives to go for the win. The time control of this event is 100 minutes for the first 40 moves, and after 40 moves, the players receive 50 minutes on the clock. From move 1, we see that there is an increment of 30 seconds. So every single move, the players receive 30 seconds on their clock. It is a lot of time, and it brings out very long games, especially because the players are not allowed to offer a draw before move 30. The first 4 rounds have already been played, so in the next 4 days we will see who will be the winner of this match. I'm doing commentary on this tournament on my Twitch channel, so if you're interested, make sure to check out my Twitch channel in the description down below. We were doing commentary every single day on this event, so make sure to check it out. But today we will have a recap of the first 4 rounds. Let's have a look what happened. In game 1, Andrei started with the white pieces, and this is how it happened. e4, e5, knight of 3, knight c6, and bishop c4. So this is very normal for both players. They're known to be playing those lines. We are in the Italian game. Bishop c5, short castle, d6. The plans are very standard, where white is trying either with c3 or d3 and d4 to ultimately play d4. And black here tries to go for a simple development with bishop e6, knight f6. At some point, knight a5 could be possible to capture this bishop, but so far, this is very standard. c3 has been played, preparing the move d4, of course. Knight f6, attacking the pawn on e4, and simply d3. And here, black played an interesting move, a5. So this move is allowing black to slide the bishop back to a7. And after rook e1, that's exactly what happened. The reason why white played the move rook e1, by the way, is because you do want to play d4 at some point. So you defend the pawn with your rook, and also at the same time, you want to perhaps consider moving the knight to d2, to f1, and then you can consider to go to e3 or g3. This is a very typical maneuver. It goes both for the Ruy Lopez and also for the Italian, because this almost transposes to Ruy Lopez type of positions. Instead, though, white played the move knight a3, and this seems like a very odd move. But the simple reason is, my opponent has played a5. This square on b5 is very vulnerable. Because of this, why not place a knight there on b5? Because c6 is not going to happen anytime soon, and I will simply be attacking this bishop on a7. Black played short castle, h3 was played, h6, knight b5, there you go, bishop b6, and here bishop e3. White is offering the trade of bishops. And after bishop takes e3, white took back with the rook. Sometimes you can consider taking back with the pawn, but in this situation, it makes more sense to take with the rook, because your rook could maneuver towards the king side to g3 to start attacking over here. And after f takes e3, it may be even harder to push the pawn to d4, because who is going to protect the pawn on e4? All right, so rook takes e3 was indeed played, rook e8, queen b3, bishop e6, takes. And there's not much going on in this position just yet. Of course, that is very typical. In the Italian, it is a very solid and calm opening oftentimes, so I'm not surprised at all. But here, white does a very interesting move. The move c4. And this move is very strange when you look at it at first sight, Because why would you play c4 voluntarily? Our goal is to play d4. And with this move, we're weakening the square d4. Now, the beauty of this move is that, first of all, you're stopping any sort of d5 from your opponent. Black's main plan over here is to push d5, and that is not going to happen anytime soon. Whereas d4 is actually not able to be occupied by any of the black pieces because look, there's a knight on f3 and the knight on b5, so that is absolutely not happening. So that's why c4 is a really strong move and also quite a surprising one. a4, queen d1, queen goes back to d1, queen d7, rook c1. The players are simply trying to improve the position of their pieces. Rook a6. So the idea behind rook a6 is actually quite interesting. Because in this position, ideally, black would want to get rid of this knight on b5 because it's a very annoying piece. And playing knight e7, c6 feels quite slow because there could be d4 pawn breaks. So for that reason, black would want to play a move like knight a7, trading off those knights. But guess what? After the move knight a7, there is suddenly a free pawn on a4. So what did black do? Instead of going for knight a7 right away, first black played rook a6 with the idea that now you are able to play knight a7 at a certain point on the next move perhaps. So this allows black to improve the position, get rid of this knight on b5, which is pretty annoying, and continue from there. Queen e2 is played by white. Knight h5. Now black has the incentive to focus on the king side simply because the queen on e2 is under attack very soon because of the move knight f4. And it is not so simple for white to stop this. Of course, you can try to play the move g3, which is very typical. I mean, why would you play knight f4, right? Because the knight will be hanging there. So it's a very nice move to cover the square f4. Or is it? Michael Adams played the move knight f4 without even hesitating about it. He played knight f4 because after g takes f4, it's not because your king is in danger. No, after e takes f4, the rook is simply trapped on e3. So not only is this king pretty vulnerable, white will simply lose material. Rook g6, pinning the pawn now, and this knight on f4 is just simply staying there. It is not going anywhere. Knight h4, attacking the rook on g6. Rook g5, you have to keep the rook on the g file. King h2, rook h5. Rook h5 is a really beautiful move because now it was clear that g takes f4 was a threat since the rook is now able to move freely. But because of rook h5, after g takes f4, suddenly the knight on h4 is hanging. You do not take first, you take on f4 first, and after the rook will have moved somewhere, you will take the knight on h4 and black will have a brilliant position. So after rook h5, knight f5 was played, knight e6, black simply retreats, and this may have been a very crucial moment because all of a sudden white's position is improving. Instead of knight e6, apparently in this position, black could have captured this pawn on h3, but afterwards in an interview with Michael, he did tell us that he was pretty unsure what was going on in this position. He was pretty scared about the position of his rook on h5. It seemed like the rook was almost getting trapped, and it was not so clear probably what would have happened after a move like g4. So it makes a lot of sense that knight takes h3 was not played. Knight e6 was played instead, and here comes white with f4. Finally, it is possible for white to improve their position. Rook b6 is played, queen f3, and in this position, the rook is under attack, but you don't really have squares available. Where do you go? And this is where Michael went for the move rook takes f5, sacrificing the exchange because after e takes f5, knight e d4, look all of a sudden after those trades how beautifully placed this knight is on d4. Queen f2 was played, e takes f4, pawn takes, and white's position looks quite awkward. Those pawns over here are very vulnerable, the king is not in the most safe position. Meanwhile, white doesn't really have any access points in black's position. They can double the rooks, they can perhaps go to e7, but what's next really? Let's find out what happened in the next few moves. Knight takes f5 is played, rook e4, king goes safely to h7, rook c2, c5. We do have to note that Andrei did not have a lot of time in this position, so he was trying to play it as safe as possible, of course. Rook ce2, and here comes black with d5. C takes d5, rook d6, because of course after queen takes d5, it looks quite dangerous with all sorts of rook e5 ideas, dropping the pawn on c5. So that makes sense to play rook d6, rook e5, f6, rook e8, now simply capturing the pawn, rook takes d3, queen e4. This looks quite scary for black, but it's just really hard to see what white can actually do. If there was a pawn on the g-file, for example on g2, g4 would have been possible, losing the knight, but because of the fact that there are no pawns around this knight is on an outpost and just simply beautifully placed, and really annoying for white. Rook d4, simply attacking the queen, queen e6 offering the trade, black captures, and now b5. So here we see that black has, for the exchange, black has two pawns, the one on c5 and the one on g7. Now, of course, if you are having an advantage, a pawn advantage on the king side, where your king is placed, that is, it is not really easy to convert that. But in this position, black is able to create a pass pawn on the queen side, the opposite side of the king. So after rook c6, c4, rook f2, and b4, black is simply slowly getting there to create a pass pawn. Rook c5, knight e3, f5. White is trying to shut down the king side and target this backwards pawn on g7. If white gets to rook c7 and the rook somehow on g2 or this rook on the 7th rank as well, this pawn on g7 will fall. But for now, there's a knight on e3 attacking f5 and also blocking the square g2. So let's see. And in this position, black went for b3, and this was the moment that black's advantage was slipping away. Instead, black had to play rook d3 here, which is a very sophisticated move and very slow move, but apparently this is the way to create a pass pawn, because the next move is simply c3, and then c2 comes soon, and then rook d1, and all sorts of things, and slowly but surely you will be able to get this pawn through. And with the move b3, it looks very promising, but simply after takes, rook a5, h5, black is trying to get the king involved, but it is already too late because rook e2 can now be played. And after rook d3, rook f2, the players simply repeated the position 3 times and agreed to a draw. It is pretty anticlimactic. It was a really exciting game in the middle game. The endgame was also very tense, but all of a sudden, all the dust got cleared and the game ended in a very clean draw. Now we are in round 2. Michael is playing with the white pieces and Andrei is playing with the black pieces. So here we see that the Sicilian was played, knight f3, d6, and bishop b5. This is one of the lines that Michael plays. Knight d7 was played after d4, c takes c4, knight takes d4 was played. This move, knight takes d4, is quite unusual. The reason is not very known to me, at least, but oftentimes queen takes d4 is played, and I can guess the reason is that typically you don't want to capture with the queen on d4 because there's moves like knight c6 possible, attacking the queen with a tempo. But now that the knight is on d7, the queen can easily capture the pawn and have a very active position. So after knight takes d4, knight f6, bishop d3, white went for a very unusual setup. Knight c5, knight c3, and this bishop on d3 feels quite bad because, well, there's a knight on c5 attacking it, and black can capture this bishop any moment, take away the bishop pair from the opponent. But in reality, if you play the move knight takes c3, c takes c3, wouldn't you want to prefer the white pieces over here, having such a nice center, having an advantage in the development of pieces? The bishop can go out easily, short castle, f4, and white's position feels more natural and just so much better. So for that reason, after knight c3, g6 was played, short castle, bishop g7, rook e1, short castle, and here bishop f1 is possible because the pawn on e4 is well protected by the knight and the rook. b6, Black is obviously trying to develop this bishop on c8. It is hard to see where this bishop can actually move because you'll have to move it to b7. It is often played in those type of structures in the Sicilian. Across this diagonal, it's hard to see where this bishop is better. Because even if you play bishop g4, f3 can be played, and it's not so clear what the point was of this move. Because now f3 is played anyways. Bishop b7 was played, bishop e3, a6, queen d2. Typically in these type of structures, black is aiming to go for a6 b5 or a6 b6 simply to stop any sort of knight maneuver to b5. And you may not want to play b5 that quickly because the more you push your pawns ahead, the more you may weaken them. Oftentimes after b5, a4 is played, pretty much attacking those pawns on the queen side. Queen c7 was played, a4, preventing b5, rook fd8, bishop h6, and the beauty of the move rook fd8 is that after moves like bishop h6, which has been played in the game, in this situation, if it was white's move and white would have played bishop h6, this bishop would not have been able to move, and white will force the trade of bishops over here. But because of rook fd8, black stepped out of this pin, so to say, so bishop can retreat to h8. Queen f2 was played, e5, and here in this situation, white was fearless. Knight f5 was played. Absolutely crazy move. And, well, the reason is simple. After g takes f5, queen g3, and there's a huge attack going on. You can stop the checkmate by playing knight g4, but if you're forced to play knight g4, we can all safely say that you're in big trouble. For that reason, after knight f5, black strikes in the center. d5 was played, and here white was not afraid at all. White played the brilliant move e takes d5, capturing this pawn on d5 and simply neglecting that there is a knight on f5 under attack. Of course it's not, but it may feel a bit strange to leave a knight hanging there, and it is not even defended by a pawn anymore. Knight takes d5, queen h4, and this move is very sneaky because it is setting up so many threats. One of the main threats is that if this knight on d5 moves, let's say knight takes c3, all of a sudden the move knight e7 check arises, and the king has nowhere to go, so black is forced to take, and after queen takes e7, I mean, white is up a queen. This must be absolutely winning for white. So queen h4 is a really dangerous move for black. So the move rook d7 was played by black, trying to stop any sort of knight e7 over here. So white took on d5, bishop takes d5, rook ad1. White is really trying to get knight to e7 with this attack on the bishop. Rook e8 was played, knight e3, bishop e6. The bishop doesn't have anything to do on this diagonal anymore. It is better placed on e6 to stop any sort of knight f5, maybe knight g4, so you can always get rid of that knight. Rook takes d7, queen takes d7, rook d1, queen c7. So white took over the d file, which can be pretty useful. White now played the move b3, bishop g7, bishop g5, and here h5 was played. This was a really surprising move to me because typically you don't want to move pawns this much ahead in front of your king, right? Because it weakens the king, it exposes yourself to attacks, for example, like g4, and yeah, it overall seems pretty uncomfortable. But in their interview, Andrei told us that this is a very positional move. And the reason is because that it stops any sort of knight g4, and g4 is actually not possible because it is not black that will be in danger over here. It will be this white king on g1 that will be in huge danger. So that's why h5 is such a strong move, a very unexpected one, but it goes to show how big the understanding is of those very strong players. So knight c4 has been played, knight b7, the knight simply retreats, king h1, b5, kicking away the knight from c4, a takes b5, a takes b5, knight e3, queen c5. Black is slowly getting more and more active. It looked like white was having the upper hand for the longest time, but all of a sudden, black is striking back. And I have to mention, Andrei was in time trouble already from move 15. I remember quite well how around move 15, Andrei was already down to 15 minutes on the clock, which is pretty devastating. And in the last 15 moves, we're now on move 30. Andrei has been playing almost the top moves every single time. He has been playing so well, and it causes white to simply not able to keep up anymore. Because look, b4 was played, queen b6, queen e1, the knight gets active on d6, queen e2, knight jumps to c4 all of a sudden, and after the capture with the bishop on c4, all of a sudden, it is very unclear where white's advantage is. It is simply fading away. Black has now the pair of bishops and much more clear prospects than white. c3 was played, queen b5, bishop d8. Honestly, this move is just beautiful. It may not make a lot of sense because you don't really achieve as much, but it just looks so pretty, right? Being able to play bishop d8 with the white pieces. It just looks so funny, right? e4 was played, a beautiful move, opening up this bishop on this diagonal. f4 was played. White did not want to capture this pawn for very obvious reasons, because after takes, there's moves like queen e5, and f4 is probably played to avoid this. Queen b8 would happen still though. Bishop g5, f6, and white is simply losing this pawn. White still tried to find counterplay by playing f5. G takes f5, bishop h4, f4. White is simply getting destroyed over here by those pawns. Look at those pawns. They're absolutely crazy. Knight d5, queen e5, knight takes f4. So white is able to capture this pawn, but bishop h6 is simply happening. Rook f1, e3, cutting off this diagonal for the queen. This knight is simply lost. You do have to be careful here with the black pieces, because if you simply capture over here, queen g6, and you might actually lose with the black pieces because of bishop takes f6 and all sorts of threats arise in the position. So after queen c2, bishop f5 was played because of this threat. Queen e2 was played, bishop takes f4, queen takes c4 check, bishop e6. White recaptured the piece, but e2 was played, almost promoting that pawn. And after a few very accurate moves, after very beautiful technique, black was able to promote this pawn, and soon black won this game. h4 was still played, and in case you're wondering, king takes h4, rook e4, winning the queen. So very, very nicely played. And after king h2, king g6, and this is the moment that Michael Adams resigned. It was suddenly Andrei that turned around this match and won this game in a very beautiful fashion. He played super, super amazingly well. In an interview, we asked that, what is it about the time trouble? Does he feel like he can play better in time trouble or not? And he was simply not so sure. I mean, of course, he is aware that he's a very strong player and he likes to believe that he plays well. But during the time scramble, he's not very conscious if he's actually playing the right moves or not. So it's really funny to see that in the time scramble, he was playing even better than before. Now let's go on to game 3. So in game 3, Andrei was again with the white pieces, Michael with the black pieces, and we saw e4, e5, knight f3, knight c6, and again a repetition of game 1 where they played Italian game. Knight f6, d3, slightly different move order, but it comes down to the same. And instead of going for the move a5, the players went for this line where black goes bishop b6 instead of a5. h3 was played, h6, knight bd2, knight e7. The knight is simply maneuvering to g6. a4 was played. Now, of course, you have to do something about this threat because otherwise bishop c5 and b4 will be played and it traps the bishop. a5 is played for that reason. Bishop b3, c6, knight f1, knight g6, knight g3. d5 was played, takes, takes. d4 was played, takes, takes. And this is a perfect symmetrical position on move 16. Rook takes e8 was played, queen takes, bishop takes d5. It's very interesting that white gives up the pair of bishops, but I guess this knight on d5 is pretty annoying. In order to change the pace of this game, it makes sense to capture the knight on d5, and it also creates a very weak pawn on d5 for black. Bishop e3, bishop c7, queen d3, black captures on g3, f takes g3, simply destroying white's pawn structure over here as well. Bishop d7, b3, queen e5. The players are simply shuffling the pieces around, trying to find a way to improve the position. Bishop f2, have to defend the pawn on g3. Rook e8, rook e1. Now the rooks are also being traded off. Knight b5. This knight is really well placed on b5, but it's really hard to see how white can actually make use of this, because it's very easy for black to defend all the pawns here. We have very few pieces on the board to attack, also to defend, but attacking is becoming much more difficult for white. Queen e5 was played, king h2, knight e7, bishop d4. There's not much to mention about this position because it is simply extremely equal and the players are trying to find a way to infiltrate in the opponent's position. But both players are playing this game very well and carefully. And after f5, this almost felt like a draw offer because you're helping your opponent to solve their pawn structure problem on the king side, and at the same time you're trading more pawns. There's more pieces being traded. Knight d4, king g8. This is also a sort of draw offer because if knight b5, king h8, the players could have gone for a threefold repetition here, but queen e2 was played instead. Andrei was still trying, and it made a lot of sense. Queen f3, offering the queen trade, b5, takes, and the players simply traded onto this position and agreed to a draw. So in this game, nothing much happened. It was just moving around left and right, and it ended in this position where there was not much to play for. I mean, opposite color bishops, that's reason enough to go for a draw. So yeah, round 3 was very safe and sound. Nothing too crazy happened in this game, and it makes sense that the players go for a draw because, especially for Michael, playing with the black pieces, having lost a previous round, going for a draw is never a bad idea. And of course for Andrei, he is ahead 1 point on the scoreboard, so he has not much to worry about. A draw is more than enough for him. And that brings us to the last game so far, round 4. Round 4, something crazy happens. Let's take a look. e4 was played by Michael, c5, knight f3, d6, the same opening as in round 2, but now after d4, c takes c4, queen takes d4 was played. So instead of going for this line with bishop b5 check, Michael now switched to d4 and took back with the queen. This was a surprise to Andrei, who spent quite some time in the opening. Knight f6, bishop e2, knight c6, queen e3, and once again Michael goes for a very unusual setup. Apparently both players each had this position played once. So that was really interesting to see. g6, short castle, bishop g7, rook d1. White is simply developing and white has many options over here. In an earlier game in this variation, Michael went for the idea of playing c4 and creating a sort of Marazzi bind type of position. But here in this game, rook d1, short castle, knight c3 was played, creating a very different dynamic in the position, because after knight g4, the queen is in a very awkward spot. Queen goes to g5. It almost feels like this queen is getting trapped, but it's not. Somehow, it's really strange. But here, black took on c3, and this looks like it's really good for black, right? I mean, b takes c3. Look at this horrendous pawn structure. It looks pretty terrible, and at the same time, black's pieces are doing fine, it feels like. But let me show you what happens in the next few moves. Queen a5, offering the queen trade. Queen h4. Queen takes c3. Michael is simply sacrificing the pawns on the queen side, which is absolutely crazy. Bishop d2, queen f6, offering the queen trade once again. Bishop g5, queen e6, and all of a sudden, it feels like this pawn on e7 is pretty loose. After knight d4, black captured. And how do you defend this pawn on e7? Because at the same time, bishop takes g4 is also I wouldn't say hanging, but it would cause black to lose his pawn for sure. And you don't want to get started on moves like f6 because, well, for one simple reason, bishop c4. And you can resign already. That's why black went for the move h6 instead, allowing bishop takes e7 to be played. g5 was played, and here we see queen takes g4, queen takes e7. Black is not trading on g4 because after queen takes g4, bishop takes g4. After bishop takes, we will see bishop takes f8, and all of a sudden white is ahead material. So you don't want to go that route. That's why after queen takes g4, queen takes e7 was played instead. Queen h5 was played, king g7, rook a d1, reinforcing the threat on d6, rook d8, and f4, launching attack on the pawn on g5. And it has a very nice idea because after g takes f4, e5 can be played, and you can start capturing this pawn on g6 and simply have a really huge pass pawn in the position. This was also the plan of Michael. In the interview afterwards, he was mentioning that this may have been a crucial moment, allowing him that after bishop e6, which was a crucial mistake by Andrei, that f5 could be played. Because after bishop takes a2, which seems like a very nice move because you simply captured the pawn, the problem is that all of a sudden rook a4 traps the bishop. This bishop has nowhere to go. And of course, any other bishop move is simply disastrous. Bishop c8 is simply a disaster move. Bishop d7 drops the pawn on d6, allows f6. The biggest downside of all of this is that f6 can be played in many positions. It's a huge threat. White could play rook f1 at some point, and you may think like, okay, I guess black can try to stop this threat, but no, after f6, suddenly queen g6 becomes possible, and this kingside is just simply falling apart for black. So that's why bishop takes a2 was played, but after rook a4, this bishop got lost. Black still tried to find some compensation with the move d5. Rook takes a2 by just simply capturing this bishop. D takes e4. The players played on for quite some time still because there is a lot going on, and honestly, if I was playing with the white pieces, I may have lost it at some point because the position is still quite complex. e3 was played. You have to be careful of this pawn on e3 with the white pieces. Rook e7. White is trying to find a way to capture this pawn on e3, playing c4 to make sure to save this pawn, of course. You need this pawn to be alive. Rook c6, rook takes a7, why not? Rook b6, rook slides back to a3, queen e5, rook d3. It was very possible for white to go for moves like f6 at some point, simply trading off all the pieces and ending up in an endgame that is completely winning. But white is taking it very easy and plays rook d3. Rook f6 was now played, and white goes here for h4, simply destructing this whole king side of black. G takes h4 was played, queen g4 check. After king h7, queen takes h4, rook e8, rook d5, queen b2. Black is still trying to make something happen here. Rook e1, rook g8, queen d4, offering the trade. And now you have to be careful here with the white pieces because if queen takes f6, suddenly a rook gets captured. And here rook d1, and that is when black resigned. So this was a very nice game of Michael. Very well executed plans and just overall very nice technique. He made it look pretty easy and overall a very smooth game. For Andrei, this is really unfortunate because once again he had huge time trouble, which has been very common throughout the match so far. This is the first half of the tournament. The score is 2-2. Michael managed to tie it in this last game, and the games have been pretty spectacular. Very instructive. We're learning a lot as we're watching those games and spectating, but the players are really putting up a fight, and I'm super excited to see what will happen in the remainder 4 rounds. Anything can happen. It's really hard to pick a favorite here because even though you might think that Andrei is running low on the clock many times, which might hurt him in a couple of games, We saw that in one game, he played like a demon. He was a genius in the time scramble. So I could definitely see him perform well in the next 4 rounds, despite his time trouble problems. At the same time, of course, Michael is very strong. So I'm really curious to see what will happen in the next 4 rounds. If you want to be able to catch those games together with me live, you can join me on my Twitch channel, twitch.tv/Anna-Maja. You can join in the chat and we can spectate those games together. I will also try to make a recap of the remainder 4 rounds afterwards. But first, let's see who is going to be the winner in this amazing, prestigious match between those very strong players.